Good evening. Tonight, we begin with a document that appeared not on television, not at a podium, not in a speech, but on a regulatory portal. It arrived without fanfare. And yet, it speaks very clearly. The document comes from the Russian Ministry of Defense. It carries the name of Defence Minister Andrey Belousov, and it outlines a proposal to expand the powers of one specific official inside that ministry. The official is Belousov's deputy, more precisely, the deputy who heads the Main Military-Political Directorate of the Armed Forces. This is not a new position, but the scope of authority described in this proposal would be new. The plan, as written, focuses on anti-corruption inspections. That phrase appears directly and plainly. The intent, according to the document, is to strengthen how those inspections are carried out. Not to replace them, not to rebrand them, but to expand what they can reach. The draft order lays out a change in access, specifically, access to information. It would allow this deputy minister to send formal requests for data during corruption checks. Those requests would not be limited to internal military records. They would extend outward, to the Bank of Russia, to credit bureaus, to other financial institutions and registry bodies. This is about widening the aperture, about giving one office the ability to look beyond the walls of the Defense Ministry, and to do so as part of official anti-corruption procedures. The document does not dramatize this change. It does not use emotional language. It does not argue. It simply describes what would be permitted if the order is adopted. Requests for financial data. Requests for registration data. Requests made in the context of inspections tied to corruption concerns. The proposal states that these changes are intended to support anti-corruption efforts. That phrasing is explicit. Support, not punishment. Access, not accusation. And the support comes in the form of information, wider access to financial and registration records, the ability to verify, to cross-check, to confirm. As one line in the document effectively suggests, sunlight works best when it reaches further. That is not written there, of course, but the logic of the proposal points in that direction. The deputy minister at the center of this plan already holds a significant role. The Main Military-Political Directorate is an established structure within the armed forces. The proposal does not create a new office. It amplifies the tools of an existing one. This matters because it frames the change as procedural, not revolutionary, not abrupt, but deliberate. The document preparing these changes was made public. It was published on a Russian regulatory portal. That publication is part of a formal process, and it made the proposal visible to anyone looking. From there, the information moved outward. Several Russian news outlets reported on it. They described the draft order. They outlined the new authorities being proposed. The reporting stayed close to the text, focused on what the order would allow, focused on the institutions named, focused on the stated purpose. No timelines are embedded in the summary of the document. No enforcement actions are described. No cases are referenced. This is about structure, not outcomes. And yet, structure determines outcomes. Who can ask questions? Who must answer them, and where those answers can be sourced. The proposal would allow the deputy minister to request information directly from financial and registry bodies. That directness is the key change. Previously, such access may have required intermediaries or separate procedures. The draft order, as described, would streamline that process. It would place the authority in one office, for the purpose of inspections tied to corruption. There is a restraint in how this is written. No sweeping language, no declarations of victory, just a methodical expansion of scope. One quiet sentence captures the tone of the entire document. This is about giving the inspection process the tools it needs. Again, not a quote from the text, but the essence of it. The focus remains internal, within the Defense Ministry, within its oversight mechanisms, within its existing hierarchy. And that is where we begin tonight, with a proposal that does not shout, that does not explain itself, that simply exists, published, formal, and precise. Sometimes the most important changes, as one might say on a night like this, arrive without raising their voice. When you read the draft order carefully, what stands out is not drama, but mechanics. This is a document about permissions, about who may ask and who must answer. At its center is a specific expansion of authority. The Deputy Defense Minister who leads the Main Military-Political Directorate would be granted the right to request information directly, not casually, not informally, but within the framework of anti-corruption inspections. The requests outlined in the proposal are precise in their targets. They include the Bank of Russia. They include credit bureaus. They include other financial and registry bodies. Each of those institutions holds different kinds of records. Financial flows, credit histories, registration data, information that exists outside the Defense Ministry's own internal systems. The proposal does not describe how often these requests would be made. It does not describe who would be inspected. It does not describe what would trigger an inspection. It simply states that, during corruption checks, the Deputy Minister would be authorized to send requests for information to these bodies. That authorization is the change. The language used in the document is functional. It does not accuse. It does not imply guilt. It does not name any past failures. Instead, it frames the change as support. Support for anti-corruption efforts. Support through access. The idea is straightforward. To check for corruption, inspectors need data. Some of that data lives beyond the Defense Ministry. This order would allow a designated official to reach it. There is no mention of expanding penalties, no mention of new investigative units, no mention of disciplinary measures, only access. Access to information that already exists, held by institutions that already collect it. The Main Military-Political Directorate is already part of the armed forces' internal structure. The Deputy Minister heading it already has defined responsibilities. This proposal would add to those responsibilities by broadening the scope of information they can formally request. The document does not redefine the mission of the Directorate. It does not alter its position within the hierarchy. It does not change reporting lines. It changes one thing: what doors can be knocked on during an inspection. The Bank of Russia is specifically named. So are credit bureaus. So are other financial and registry bodies. Those references are concrete. They point to established institutions. They indicate where information would be sought. The proposal also makes clear that these requests would be part of anti-corruption checks, not audits, not general reviews, but inspections tied to corruption concerns. That framing matters. It situates the expanded authority within an existing process. It does not create a new category of inquiry. The document was prepared as a draft order. That means it is part of a formal regulatory process. It is not an announcement. It is not a press release. It was published on a Russian regulatory portal. That publication is a standard step in the process of introducing regulatory changes. It allows the text to be reviewed, referenced, and reported on. And it was reported on. Several Russian news outlets covered the document. They described its contents. They outlined its intent. The reporting focused on what the order would allow: requests for information, wider access to financial and registration data, support for anti-corruption inspections. There was no embellishment in those reports. They reflected the document as written. They stayed within its bounds. This is a procedural story, about authority, about access, about internal mechanisms. It is also a story about how systems attempt to monitor themselves, how oversight is structured, how information flows. The proposal assumes that access to external data strengthens internal checks. That is the logic embedded in the text. It is not argued. It is presented as a given. The draft order does not explain why this expansion is being proposed now. It does not reference past cases. It does not cite statistics. Those absences are notable for what they are not. They are not filled with speculation. They are simply left blank. Instead, the document confines itself to what it does. It describes a change in authority. It names the institutions involved. It states the purpose. The purpose is repeated in different forms. Strengthening anti-corruption inspections, supporting anti-corruption efforts, providing wider access to relevant data. Those phrases anchor the proposal. They are the through line. They connect the technical language to a stated goal. And in the middle of all that formal phrasing, there is an emotional undercurrent that is almost easy to miss. It is the recognition that oversight depends on visibility, that checks depend on information. As one might say quietly, you can't verify what you can't see. The proposal does not promise results. It does not claim success. It does not predict outcomes. It changes the rules of access and leaves the rest to the system as it exists. The Deputy Minister's expanded powers, as described, are specific and limited. They apply in the context of corruption checks. They apply to requests for information. They do not grant unilateral investigative authority. They do not bypass existing institutions. They work through formal requests. That detail matters. It keeps the change within a procedural frame. It emphasizes process over personality. This is not about who holds the position. It is about what the position can do. And so the document sits where it was placed. Published, reported, waiting within the regulatory process. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. By the time this draft order appears on a regulatory portal, its work has already begun. Not in enforcement, not in inspection, but in definition. It defines what authority would look like if adopted. It defines where information may be requested from. And it defines how anti-corruption checks inside the Defense Ministry could be supported with broader access. Nothing in the document signals urgency. Nothing signals crisis. It does not declare an emergency. It does not claim a turning point. Instead, it settles into the administrative record. A proposal written in the language of procedure, published through formal channels, observed and reported by news outlets doing exactly what such outlets do. They noted its appearance. They summarized its contents. They described its intent. And the intent, as stated, remains narrow and consistent: to strengthen anti-corruption inspections, to do so by expanding access to financial and registration data, to place that access in the hands of a specific deputy minister. The document does not wander beyond that purpose. It does not branch into other reforms. It does not extend to other ministries. It does not redefine corruption itself. It stays where it started, inside the Defense Ministry, inside existing oversight mechanisms, inside a defined chain of authority. The Main Military-Political Directorate remains what it is. Its head remains who he is. What changes, if the order is adopted, is the reach of an inspection request. A request that can move outward, toward the Bank of Russia, toward credit bureaus, toward financial and registry bodies that hold records relevant to verification. That outward reach is the entire substance of the proposal. There is no additional layer hidden beneath it. No secondary mandate implied. The draft order does not describe outcomes. It does not describe consequences. It does not describe what happens after information is obtained. Those steps already exist elsewhere in regulation and practice. This proposal does not replace them. It feeds into them. By being published on a regulatory portal, the document enters a public procedural space. That publication allows it to be seen, to be cited, to be discussed in the context of regulatory change. And that is exactly how it has been treated: as a regulatory proposal, as a description of expanded authority, as a technical adjustment with a clearly stated purpose. There is no emotional language in the document, no rhetorical flourish, no attempt to persuade. It assumes that its purpose is self-evident, that strengthening inspections requires access, that access requires authorization, that authorization must be written. That assumption carries the entire text. And yet, behind that assumption is a quiet acknowledgement that corruption checks depend on information beyond internal records, that financial and registration data matter, that oversight to function must see across systems. The proposal does not argue this point. It operationalizes it. It does so by naming institutions, by specifying who may request data, by limiting the context to anti-corruption inspections. Those limitations are as important as the expansion itself. They define the boundaries. They keep the authority contained. The deputy minister would not be granted unrestricted access. The authority applies during inspections. It applies for a defined purpose. That framing keeps the change procedural rather than political. It anchors it in function rather than intent. And so, when Russian news outlets reported on the document, their coverage reflected that tone. They did not speculate. They did not extrapolate. They described what the draft order would allow. They identified the institutions involved. They noted the stated goal of strengthening anti-corruption efforts. Nothing more, nothing less. The proposal exists now as text, as published material, as part of a regulatory process. It has not yet become action. It has not yet altered practice. It has not yet been tested. Those steps, if they come, are beyond the document itself, and beyond what the document claims. For now, what exists is permission, written permission, for information to move where it previously could not. And sometimes, that is how systems change, not with announcements, not with speeches, but with a paragraph added to an order, with a signature proposed, with access defined. There is a line one could imagine being said quietly, almost off camera, about moments like this. This is how oversight learns to look further. It is not a declaration. It is not a promise. It is a description of process. And that is where this script ends. Not with resolution, not with conclusion, but with a document, published, precise, and waiting within the system it seeks to adjust.